right, everybody. Welcome once again to European Week. We had the chance to say this online to everybody yesterday and to some who were already in London yesterday, but today we have the full cohort here for European Week 2024. So welcome to the LSE, welcome to London. And so for this first panel this evening, we're going to be confronting an important question that has to do with what migrants have to do to demonstrate their worth for entering societies that they want to enter. Increasingly, we've seen in contemporary migration governance and patterns of migration that there's a more individual focus on people having to prove that they deserve to come into certain societies rather than the assumption being that people have that right or that they would be of value to the society. So what do migrants have to do to demonstrate these kinds of qualities? So these are the main questions for the panel here today. You know, we've asked the presenters to think about these questions ahead of time, and I'll introduce them to you in a moment. But the questions that they'll be discussing are these. First of all, we've asked them in view of their expertise, what do they think is the relevance of merit in migration governance in Europe today? How do we see merit being defined in different contexts in Europe, or deservingness of entry into a European society? And then if we think about the recent crises that have happened, major crises in Europe in the last few years, say we start with 2015 and the events related to migration that year, or we talk about COVID-19 and the pandemic, or we talk about the war in Ukraine, how have these crises changed things, if at all, with respect to this broader historical pattern by which migrants have to more individually make the case for why they deserve to be in the society to which they want to gain entry? So let me quickly introduce the panelists, and then we'll get to their remarks. So to my right is Professor Laurence Romani. She's a professor of management and organization, also the director of the Center for Responsible Leadership and CIVICA academic lead for the Stockholm School of Economics. And her work focuses largely on how organizations contribute to an inclusive society, with a focus on how to encourage interaction in mutually respectful and beneficial ways with those who are perceived as society's cultural others. Obviously, this has a lot to do with migration. To her right is Borja Santos. He is the executive director at IE in Madrid, the School of Public and Global Affairs. There he specializes in international development, social entrepreneurship, and public policy. He has designed and implemented major public policies and international programs in countries in Africa, Europe, America, and Asia, worked with the governments of Sri Lanka, Peru, and Belize on international development banks. And he also writes prolifically for the general public. To his right is Professor Oksana Mikheieva. She is professor of sociology at the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv. From 2020 to 2023, she was a day visiting professor at the European University, Viadrina Frankfurt. In spring semesters of 2020 and 2022, she was also a visiting lecturer at the Jagiellonian, I'm sorry, I don't pronounce that right, University in Krakow, Poland. More recently, she joined the Berlin-based Center for East European and International Studies in 2023 to work on a research project about the everyday experiences of forced Ukrainian migrants in the EU. And then to her right is Dr. Marta Pachocka. She is the head of the Migration Policies Research Unit at the Center of Migration Research of the University of Warsaw, as well as professor in political studies and international studies at the SGH Warsaw School of Economics. She has been a team leader and a member in cross-sector projects funded by the National Science Center, the National Bank of Poland, and various major EU programs. And Dr. Pachocka also supports the European Commission representation in Poland as an EU expert member of the Team Europe Network. So let's hear from our panelists now. Then we'll have a few minutes of discussion among ourselves up here on stage, and then open it up in the last 10 or 15 minutes to some comments and questions from the audience before we split up into the workshops. And at the very end, Vincent will give directions about where people should, that's Vincent down there, about where you go after this panel concludes in about 45 minutes, okay? Laurence.
Thank you. So you had two questions. Maybe I answer very quickly the second one right away. And the answer is not much change. And let me answer the first one and give you. Migraine system. I have a perspective on management, and a lot of what I'm going to say is from the management perspective and from the organization perspective. And I also work a lot with high-skilled migrants. So some of the things I'm going to say from the research we've been doing does not necessarily apply to a person who do not have a higher education, for example. Also, I'm from Sweden, and a lot of my research has been done in Sweden. So it's very much like a Swedish high-skilled migrant perspective from organizations. So that you know. So to answer your question, I think there are three major ways that merit and migration are connected in the world of organizations. And basically, it all goes about, I would say, recruiting and maintaining and promoting persons with a migration background in organizations. So the first way to look at this, how are merits or how do merits play a role in the inclusion of migrant in organization, would be there are very many studies in sociology called the studies you have heard of. They will send fake CVs, the very same CV with two different names to organization recruiting. And then you will see, it's called correspondence studies, you will see that there are very different outcomes. So the person who are stigmatized in society, the person we have, let's say in Europe in general, you find many studies where on the fake CV you have the name of a person with ethnic majority, if you want to call it like that, and an ethnic minority. And the person with ethnic minority CV, and again, remember, it's exact same content of the CV except the name, they will receive like 20%, 30% fewer call back to come to an interview to have a position. So this is the kind of things that organizations are a role, an actor in the governance of migration, because they reproduce, it's not that there's the plan, but they reproduce societal stereotypes on migrant applicants and therefore reproduce their marginalization or not. So the stereotypes on persons with a migration background or migrants would be sometimes negative. They will be dangerous, foreign, sometimes they are positive. For example, those studies, you know, those correspondence studies with the CV, and sometimes have the Arab sounding name in France. Advantage. It's because it depends on the situation, it depends on the job. So for example, if you're a female, middle-aged, Muslim woman, and then you apply for a job in the health and care sector, well, maybe you have an advantage because you have a stereotype of being, you know, one of the person fitting this kind of job. So it's fully a stereotype, you know, but then it can be to your advantage. So my first point really is that how do organizations play a role in the governance of migration in relation to merits, is that when they screen CVs, the merits are not really appreciated for exactly what they are. They are appreciated in the view of the stereotypes that we reproduce unwillingly on the applicants. So that's the first way. The second way is more linked to organizations in themselves, the features of organizations. So for example, if you're a local organization, or if you're an international organization, you have different ways of assessing the merits of your applicants. So organizations that have international clients, they are international themselves. They tend to have more diversity of person among their employees than organizations that are only local and that work with very local clients. So the feature of the organization plays a role. Whether the industry is screaming for more people or not, that also has an influence. In the industry, like in IT, you have a lot of diversity, a lot of person with a migration background. Another element would be whether the organization culture is open to diversity and inclusion. So whether there are programs, trainings being done to lead to inclusive recruitment or not. So that will also influence. So And then finally, the recruiters. If you have a team of recruiters who are only from ethnic minority and all from the same gender, they don't recruit the same way as recruiters who have an international experience, who are diverse themselves. So organization, and that's my second point, organization in their features, whether they're international, whether the team of recruiter is international, will also play a role in the governance of migration, because they also contribute to hire out or leave outside of the organization person with a migration background. And now my last point is much more on merit and merit themselves. In a recent study that I've done with Paulo Velasquez, we looked at how how recruiters really recruit in terms of how do they look at merit. And there the distinction between categorical merit and consequential merit became very interesting regarding person with a migration background. So let me explain. When you recruit someone, you will have a job ad saying you need this amount of years of experience, you need a degree from engineering, you need this and that. These are categorical merits. This is what the ad explains. And then people will apply. And recruiters, HR people, the managers recruiting, they will scan the CVs, looking at those categorical merits. Has this person indeed have experience with project management? Has this person indeed been, responsible for a large team? And they will shortlist the person who fit those categorical merits. But then what happens? Those with most merit, most categorical merit, they're invited to interview. And then the things change. The things change for consequential merit. And you all know what consequential merit is. It means what will be the consequence of hiring you instead of someone else? And what is interesting with this notion is that it privileges those who are already in the organization, and it's against those who are different. Let me give you an example. I told you from Sweden. So you will see in Sweden, a leadership style commonly agreed as the most desirable leadership style will be very consultative. So you consult your partners, even your clients, you tend to make decisions in a consultative way. Right? Imagine you have two applicants, both very highly meritorious. So the categorical merit are very high. And during the interview, you realize that one has a pretty directive way of managing, and the other one has a much more consensus-oriented way of managing. So which one will you take? You know that your team is international but Swedish, and they're used to consensual way of doing of being managed. So you will go for the person whose hiring has the consequence that you wish for. And then you think that if you hire someone who fits the existing team, that is like your existing team, that you're gonna have better consequences than if you hire someone who's different. And that's a big myth. Most people think that if you hire people who are like you, you're going to work better together. It's actually not the case. This is moderated by one aspect, and that's respect. And I do research on respect. So it's not because you are working with people who are like you that you'll work well. It's because you respect people who are like you. So the very last element in recruitment is this idea of fit, is the consequence. Okay, I go for this candidate because the consequences are more positive for my team. And this is an imagination. You don't know. And you often believe that a fit being similar is good, but actually it's not necessarily the case. So these are the three major points of how organizations reproduce stereotypes from society, the features of the organization, the team, the recruitment team plays a role in defining merit, and also how in the act of recruiting, merits are changed and are redefined, and against often those who are different and those who have a different way of working, and almost by definition, those coming from a different place. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Laurence.
Yeah.
You'll notice that we're talking about governance here, which is not the same thing as government, right? We are going to talk about laws and public regulations on the entry of migrants into European countries, but we started off in this way just to demonstrate that we're talking about something broader too, in which lots of different kinds of organizations play a role in managing, regulating, affecting how migration occurs. So let's hear from Borja now.
Thank you. Because I work in development, let me before talking directly about merit, let me talk go one step back. I mean, I think, first of all, I thank you very much, LSE and CIVICA, to choose migration as the topic of this year, European Week, because I think it's very important because migration is in the center of the polarization in the politics in Europe. And second, because migration is the biggest tool for development for many low and mid-income countries, right? Not only because it increases the GDP per capita, because of remittances, is the biggest source, 3 times bigger than ODA, official development assistance, or even direct investment flows, and also because of the transfer of know-how. So then, I think it's good that we talk about merit, because it means that we are trying to debate about the management of migration flows. And this is very important because one of the mistakes that happens in the European policies is that we focus a lot when we talk about migration on contention, and development. What do I mean by that? When we talk about migration, we said, hey, let's tighten our borders, and therefore we go to the countries of origin and we externalize security. We try to strengthen that it's more difficult to migrate, right? And this is a mistake. Why? Because it's very much demonstrated that the incentives to migrate are much bigger than the barriers a migrant will find. What do I mean by that? That is stronger the opportunities for labor in another country or the socioeconomic situation of the migrant, that is much stronger than any barrier the migrant will find. So the stronger is the barrier to migrate, the more risk will take the migrant, but it will not reduce the incentive. So this should be clear, right? So that's why here we are talking about management, the migration flows, because this is where the focus of the debate should be, not in tightening and strengthening the borders, because the only thing that we are doing that is that more people will die looking for riskier barriers. And the second misconception is, if you develop the country of origin, therefore people will not migrate because they are in better socioeconomic situations. But there is an author that you should research if you like this topic, that is Michael Clemens, that demonstrated something very interesting, that in a low-income country, the higher is the development and the GDP per capita of the people of that country, the higher is the possibility that these people migrate. What do I mean by that? That the more developed is a poor country, the higher are the possibilities that people migrate. So it's not the opposite. Sometimes we think like, okay, if you help them escape from poverty, they will not migrate. But actually it's the opposite. Why? Because they have higher education, because there is an economy less dependent of agriculture, is more urban, and other demographic factors. So the fact that we develop the country of origin and they will travel less, that's false. Therefore, we come back to them. So I think this is important to understand, because instead of focusing on this kind of focus that Europe puts, like externalization of barriers, borders, and developed country of origins, we focus on management of the migration flows. And then we come to merit. Another thing that I would like, another idea is, what is merit? Sometimes merit, we think about, it comes to our mind, high skill people, right? High skill migrants. And there is, of course, a lot of policies to attract migrants in STEAM, because you want people who work in science and technology, because you want an economy with know-how, with more know-how, right? But the reality is that merit can mean different things. Merit, for me, is not only about capacities or skills. Merit could be, for instance, age. The Banco de España, the main government Spanish bank, the state bank, I would say, it said the other day that in the next 30 years, Spain would need 25 million immigrants in a working age. And we don't care about the qualification. Why? Because Spain has a big economy in tourism. Spain's, I mean, you will require a lot of migrants in the age economy, basically in the daily care of many people that gets old, right? And so it's a big industry. You require a lot of people in home duties and home responsibilities. So how much is the qualification that you require? Basically, you need people who really want to work and that are integrated and and integrated in a social cohesion, right? So sometimes age can be, sometimes it could be rudeness. It can be that there is attachments with the families that already live in the country of origin, and it will be easier to adapt them into your reality and into your society. So the merit is actually not a qualification. The merit is that you have already a connection, right, with that country. Therefore, it will be easier to integrate that person into your country. So my idea here is that when we think about merit, it's very good that we talk about qualifications, because many of the agreement and the flows and the ideas and the policies are related to that. But we should expand the idea of merit to other concepts, right? What do we, I mean, in order to do that, I think we need in Europe a flexible, a more dynamic merit-based system. That when I say flexible and dynamic, I mean about all these factors that I mentioned before. And it's very important as well to simplify the procedures to recognize those merits, because one of the main issues is that if we talk about merits, but a migrant has a lot of difficulties to recognize, legitimize, or the qualifications that they acquire in the country of origin, so the merit will not be valuable, right? So we should simplify those things. And finally, the last thing is that sometimes when we talk about these labor mobility agreements and we talk about merit, we only talk about governments. And I think we need to talk about three partners. We need to talk about governments, but we need to talk about the businesses, and we need to talk about the workers. So I highly recommend you to check something called the Labor Mobility Partnerships. It's a global initiative that basically identify what are the best policies to arrange these kind of agreements based on merit and all these expanded concepts that I mentioned. What are the main policies for business, for governments, and for workers to really find migration corridors to really work in another country, right? So I highly recommend you as a student to check, because there is a lot of ideas and a lot of inspiration there.
Thanks, Borja. Okay, let's go down and hear from Marta next.
So hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here, and I hope that some of you know me from the online course we had together around a week ago, and also I see some faces from Warsaw School of Economics. So we have some key terms that were used in the title of this discussion, but also in the main packages of the questions. So the first question is about merit. So I like this kind of question: to what extent this merit or these merits matter? So the answer is very simple. They matter, and it's not only in case of the migration governance or migration policies or migration control. It's, I would say, very typical, and a lot of frameworks are merit-based in case of democratic countries and those that are market economy driven. And this is especially true for the countries from Central and Eastern Europe that were affected by being a part of Eastern Bloc. So also that experienced what we call 1989 and early 1990s multidimensional transition. So in our case, we are, so I mean here, for example, Poland and some other new member states, we are just catching up the Western European countries. So especially this merit is strongly visible in how we are educated, for example, as economics students, but also as business students. So for me, merit is something very natural. And when I'm expected to assess if merit is something wrong, I would say, no, it's not wrong. The question is how it is applied, how it is framed, and how it is used. And instead of focusing on the EU migration governance level, I would like to refer especially to the second part of the question that was framed by Paul and our team. So the most recent emergencies or crises. And in case of Poland, I think that a lot has changed, or at least other aspects of merit-based migration management matter because of the full-scale Russian aggression in February 2022 in Ukraine. Why Ukraine and why Poland? So before 2022, we had as a country a huge percentage of Ukrainians among the total foreign population. So In 2021, as provided by the Polish Central Statistical Office, around 64% of foreigners legally staying in Poland were Ukrainians. These were mostly voluntary migrants, as we can classify them. So those that came to Poland mostly for work, very often seasonal work or family reunification, but also for education. I have many Ukrainian students at my home university. But early 2022 has changed a lot because once again, Ukrainian migration is the prevailing one, but now of forced nature. So now we have around 3 million Ukrainian citizens staying in the country, more or less half of them being still those classified as voluntary migrants, the other half those that are considered temporary protection beneficiaries or other forms of protection. So where we have merit here. So I would say that merit is, in this very specific case, merit is applied both for this pre-2022 Ukrainian migration, because these were simply Poland is running out of labor force. We are also depopulating and we are aging, and these are the demographic phenomena typical for many Central and Eastern European countries. So before 2022, we needed our economy, our labor market were in need of foreign labor force, and Ukrainian migration was a great case here. Very often, even we called this migration Ukrainization of migration, of economic migration. So these were the merits of these migrants. So they were usually in working age, reproductive age also, but contributing to our economy and to our labor market. But this was mostly circular short-term migration. Let me not go now into details of our migration and labor market law and policies. So what's going on with this new 2022 forced migration from Ukraine? Usually we say that merit does not matter so much for forced migration governance, because here we do not assess how these people may contribute to our society or to labor market. We just should use the international refugee legal framework or European one and assess case by case if the people are in need of protection. So with Ukrainian forced migrants, the story is a bit different because we used another legal framework from the EU level, but in case of Poland, also our own new law that was developed. So we provided the mass protection status that is called temporary protection. And in case of Poland, we developed, the government, the new law specifically devoted to Ukrainian citizens and the close members of their families, saying, okay, guys, so we give you much more in terms of the access to public services and goods than it is stipulated at the level of the European Protection Directive. So you can stay here much longer. As of today, the Ukrainian migrants will be allowed to stay till the end of September 2025. So few months longer than in case of most of the EU countries. Also, you can have a direct access to our labor market. One issue is here crucial. You can be an entrepreneur. So in Poland, it's not typical to offer a foreigner staying legally a direct access to this kind of economic activity. So entrepreneurship is very important because this Ukrainian forced migration is highly feminized, with women having kids. So these provide them with much more flexibility. So once again, we have forced migration, but in fact, that can be used as socio-economic and even demographic asset. So they can easily contribute to our national labor market, but also to the society. Why? Let's look at schools, for example. We received around 400,000 Ukrainian kids for primary, secondary school. In obvious, there is the issue of language, assistants, psychologists, but it is very important also in terms of this contribution to our education system. So I would say that simply what we did in Poland, we turned this forced migration in a smart way, do not saying it openly, into merit-based, almost economic migration. And in fact, Polish government wants to keep these migrants in the country. It will not be said openly because it matters for the meta-level relations between the government and Ukrainian government. Obviously, say we cannot lose our human capital, our social capital, our people. The issue of the brain drain. But in practice, each country has its own interests, and we can see it well in case of Poland. So I think I will stop here.
Thank you, Marta. Okay, Oksana will give us the last set of remarks before we move into discussion mode.
Thank you. First of all, I'm happy to be here. And as a sociologist, I look on this similar problem maybe from the little bit other point of view, not from the point of management, not from the point of view of policies, but from the point of view how people perceive these policies, how these policies influence their everyday lives in the countries, in EU countries. And here I want to talk about, first of all, the situation with some disbalance from my point of view between the logic of merit-based migration policy and short-term labor market needs. For example, last 3 years spent in Germany, originally from Ukraine. After 2014, I start working with a different group of people in Ukrainian society affected by the war. And first of all, with internally displaced person, and then with people who moved abroad. And in this case, we see this problem with many Ukrainians who now stay in many European countries. I absolutely agree with this point of view that all countries have their own interests. But in this case, what is very important for me is the interest of Ukraine towards their citizens. Because in this case, I'm not sure that this scenario that we develop the country where we take migrants, in Ukrainian case, we see that now we are working with the black box because many people don't know anything about their future. They have not any information for making decision for the future. And all sociological survey, when sociologists ask people about their future plans, are failed because people really have not enough information for making decisions about their future. Then they face with the many problems in the country of destination. Of course, I absolutely agree that we have this situation that it's mostly we are talking about the women with children. And this resource, when we talk about the age, play a very important role. It's very important how old these children and what policies have the different countries towards this different group of people with small children, with other group of children, etc., because it's about access to labor market too. Then it's about education. According to sociological survey, 62% of Ukrainians have higher education. It's a very high educated group. And in this case, many of them face with the problem of recognition of their diplomas. We are talking about the big amount of money for people who are in need, who have a status of forced migrants. Usually it takes from 700 euros and to 1.5, because you need to translate your diploma. You need to notarify this document, and this process of recognition take time, take efforts, and take money. Not all migrants have this chance. And the special case, from my point of view, it's a case of people who represent academic circles. Because in many European countries, many representatives of this group live in precarious situation. It's usually from project to project. It's not so often when people have permanent positions. And here we face with a new type of competition between locals and migrants who pretend to some places in the society, who are very high educated, who have a very high skills. And from my point of view, sociological point of view, when I compare the situation in Ukraine and now in Europe, I see a very big problem. Because many representatives of this group who moved from Ukraine to Europe, it's a very well integrated in common European space part of Ukrainian academia. But for all migrants, it's a very common characteristic of migrants, usually overqualified. They occupy the places which not need so high a level of education. And in this case, Ukraine lost a very high qualified workers and academics, but unfortunately, the country who receive these migrants not use their potential, how it's possible and how it will be very good for their markets. Why it's so important to look on this problem, not only in the frame of one country. Today, migration goes brought behind the borders of the countries. It's a very important, and now when we conducted an in-depth interview, we find so many very funny situations. People, for example, have a Ukrainian citizenship, then they receive a citizenship in one of the EU countries, and it means that they live in other country, take a political have a political activity in Ukraine, for example, working activity in Europe. It's usually a question of remittances, etc., etc. And we see these new transnational networks of people who create absolutely new reality, which push us thinking under the what citizenship means today, what merit means for us today, how to assess merit in current situation, and what the short and long perspective in assessing of these merits of migrants, forced migrants, and people who are locals. I don't know how now talk about locals in this context. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Oksana. I want to just pose an issue here that kind of ties together the comments before we open it up to a couple of questions and then move on to the workshop part. It strikes me that time and issues that have to do with time and temporality play an interesting role in each one of your comments here. I was struck, Oksana, by what you said about Ukrainian forced displaced persons not being able to make plans for the future, not having a sense of futurity, what life will be like and how to plan for that. And time comes up in different ways. Marta mentioned the extended, relatively speaking, time frame for Ukrainian displaced persons to stay in Poland, the forward-thinking nature, it seems, of Polish migration governance when it comes to incorporating the Ukrainization, did I get that right, of migration into Poland, looking at the contributions to education, to the labor markets and many sectors of the economy, which also seems to be part of what's happening in Spain. If you say, yes, 25 million migrants are necessary to ensure something as basic as care for the elderly in that society. And then time, I think, plays into your comments too, Laurence, when you spoke about the way that organizations will tend to favor candidates that seem familiar in a certain way. Well, how do you come to seem familiar? Over time, it takes time and sort of familiarity. Political theorist Joseph Cairns, who actually argued in his book, The Ethics of Immigration, that 10 years is about a good enough time for someone to just merit entry, because after 10 years, you've become a member of the community in all kinds of different ways. So I wonder if you all have any further thoughts on that. And especially, I guess my question is about how can societies and organizations best stretch their thinking about the timeframes that are needed? And would you agree that crisis thinking is maybe not in our favor here, because crisis thinking tends to focus our analysis on the moment rather than the long term?
I can start.
Marta. Yeah. Whoever.
I cannot agree that what is here and now, so this crisis mode is not important. It's, I would say it matters a lot, because in fact we are now moving from one crisis to another. So something that we considered a few years ago as an emergency, really crisis, I would say this is the mode we are living in and operating since at least 2015, if we look from this migration governance angle in the EU context, because there is always something going on. So 2015 relocation issue and Mediterranean region, 2021 in case of eastern border, not only Poland and Belarus, 2022 full-scale war, 2014 the beginning of the Ukrainian Russian aggression in Ukraine. In the meantime, we have something that is more to mobility restriction related, but still mattered for intra-EU migration and extra-EU migration, so COVID-19. So there is always something going on. Visa crisis or in case of Poland. So time matters, and this crisis mode is becoming our new reality. So sometimes we call it routinization, normalization simply of this crisis mode way of governing. What comes next? I have no idea. Now maybe the full scale physical war in eastern part of the EU, because it's already knocking to our door in Poland, and this is discussed. This is on political agenda in the country. Then this time issue, temporariness, or in case of internally displaced people. If this is in Ukraine, it's not so bad because still they are at home, let's say. But if this is about the TPS as a form of protection that is still prolonged, and in fact, we don't know if there is no need in 2025 to prolong it once again. So what will be put on the table by the EU as the pan-European legal solution to take care of people in need if the war is not over? What we will offer? Maybe we'll take something into account in terms of the EU accession preparation. So just maybe to extend in a way the Schengen zone to make much easier for Ukrainian citizens or other people with legal statuses in Ukraine to move as we do as EU citizens. So time matters, and crisis mode is a new reality, I would say.
Yeah, thank you for pointing this element of time. If I rephrase in a very simple way, some of the comments that I've heard about time would be, oh, don't worry too much about this discrimination, because it is discrimination in the sense of the different treatment of person with a migration background, because in 10 years we'll be used to them and they won't be discriminated. You know? So of course, this is not what you said, but this is something you hear. And I'll agree with you, Marta. No, we are in a crisis and we need to remain in the crisis. You cannot ask a person to wait 10 years before having significant employment. You cannot ask children to grow up in a society where they are seen and stigmatized for the most important part of their youth, and then telling them, oh, it'll be better later. When I told you about stereotypes and how organizations reproduce stereotypes in society, it seems that stereotypes do not change that much over time, unfortunately. So 10 years is nothing, and they will not change stereotypes. Maybe we're talking about 100 years, I don't know. In some other, yeah. So organization also, as Borja was saying, organizations are in need of talent now. So we are actually, maybe we should be more in terms of a crisis situation by saying we have to open the door to organization and stop this idea of fit and this idea of merit, and be much more inclusive and thinking we have to include people now. We cannot wait. We cannot ask people to continue waiting 2 years to receive, you know, a work permit, or waiting. This is so much waiting. Time is actually a very important issue in the topic of migration. Thank you.
I like your comments, like pushing back against my idea here and saying no. Impatience and a certain amount of crisis thinking can be beneficial. So, Oksana, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I want to jump in this conversation about time, because from my point of view, it's very, very important. When we study Ukrainian internal displacement, we found a very good formula. It's postponed life, because people usually waiting when their life normalized, but it's never happen again. Because we have this crisis, like crisis, and we work with this situation of full uncertainty. We don't know how to solve this problem, and we need to find a formula how to work with people in such conditions, how to push them not waiting, live here and now. It's very important when we work with migrant groups, and we have here so many factors which influence on these processes. It's a mental health situation. Very often we lose this aspect, but it's aspect are very, very important. If we talk about the Ukrainian migrants, it's people who are traumatized by the war, but we never have immediate reaction of psychological trauma. Usually these reactions postponed, and after 1 or 2 years, people start feel themselves very bad in the these mental health issues, mental health problem, etc., etc. Then the other factor very important, it's a language. We are talking about people who are not ready for this migration, who have not a good strategy for migration. It was unexpected for them, and they started their new life in other countries. Of course, Ukrainians have a chance to choose the different countries, but for example, it's a common situation situation for Ukrainian schools that Ukrainians mostly know English language, but French or German language, it's a very big issue for many of them. And in this case, for example, in our previous research, when we tried to measure how many time people, labor migrants, not forced migrants, how many time people need for integration in Poland, it usually takes for Ukrainians half a year, but in France or Germany, it takes minimum 3 years. And now we are talking about 3 years of war. It's a time when we need to have some decision.
Thought on this, Borja?
Well, let's say that instead of call it crisis, let's reframe it to opportunity. Opportunity, right? And I see 3 layers because we are focusing only on the conflict, but I see 3 layers. I think there is one crisis opportunity after COVID, because I think before COVID we were thinking that the needs in Europe were temporary in different labor and in different sectors, and I think COVID demonstrated that we have structural needs in Europe because of demographic and because of economic reasons for more migration. And so there is a structural need of migrants. Second, there is another opportunity versus crisis, depending how do you see it, on the regularization of irregular migrants. Spain, for instance, have 500,000 of people that are irregular migrants. This is a big problem. This is a big crisis, and that happens in many European countries as well. Why? Because first of all, those countries do not have rights for many issues, for health services, for even for housing, for many things, but also they cannot accomplish their responsibilities, meaning paying taxes, meaning many things, right? So there is a big opportunity as well to produce regularizations that favor the cohesion and the inclusion of those migrants. And then you have the other layer that it will be those large-scale displacements that happen now because of the war in Ukraine, but also happened before in Syria. I would say, I don't know what Europe can do in the midterm if the situation remains, but I would say there is an opportunity because, for instance, what happens with the Syrian crisis? So EU did an agreement with Turkey to really strengthen the border controls, right? So we pay the government of Turkey to say, no, we don't want Syrian. But in Ukraine has been different. It has been a big solidarity temporary protection mechanism. And I think that's something positive that Europe, in a very short amount of time, has been able to put in place this temporary protection mechanism that we didn't do with other type of population that maybe we did not consider that it was part of our identity or it was not our crisis. So I think we could see something positive. So I think these 3 layers of structural needs, regularizations inside of the countries, and also large-scale displacements due to conflicts are in parallel.
Very good. Can we go a few minutes more, or does the reception have to start at 7:30?
It does, but we have breakout groups.
Yeah, we have the breakout groups. Okay. So why don't we do that then? We've had a lot of comments here. I think you guys need some time to discuss these things among yourselves. So let's do breakout groups for the next half an hour, and then go right to the reception. You want to do Q&A? How about a couple? Okay, that's what I was asking. Yeah, whether we can do that. Okay, we'll get a couple of questions here. Let's hear students. Yeah, and if you would actually, if you have a question, raise your hand up high so I can see you, and Vincent can bring you the microphone. And if you would direct it to one of the speakers, just one of the speakers.
Working?
Yeah. And let's keep our responses.
Thank you for the discussions. Also, just a couple of comments.
Sorry?
Thank you for the discussions and just a couple of comments. To the second speaker, I want to say that I participated in a couple lectures about migration. So what you said about the different policies and now border controls, as well as externalization, they all don't really work. So, and yet we still see that the UK with Rwanda or also the EU policies are still focused on that. About development, I want to say that what I studied previously is about the migration hump, which could be what you were talking about previously, about development, so the wages and GDP increasing but decreasing, and when as it is increases, also the migration keeps increasing, right? Migration to other countries. That could be the research you were talking about. And my point is more political, I guess. How can we reframe and also kind of recognize that all migrants are similar and not just look at Ukrainians as someone that we have to treat differently from, I don't know, like African countries and migrants? Why is it that the disparity between how we treat these kinds of candidates and workers is so different? But on a more optimistic note, I would like to say that these latest generations, have been talking so much about like diversity and inclusion and queerness. So I think the future recruiters will also be more open and accepting of all these different characteristics and migrants. That's my point of view. Like
this
what I
was-
would like to think about.
Was this a question for Borja then?
Yeah, also just to
Just a
further
comment.
inspire the discussions, not really anyone.
This definition of a migrant is very interesting because I used to be a development worker for United Nations. And when I was living in another country, I was calling myself an expat, right? So, however, when you see someone else in your country, you call it an immigrant, right? So I think this definition is very interesting.
Yeah.
Good point. Another question here. Speak nice and loud.
Hello. So thank you for the talk. So obviously we were talking about how we kind of always favor people that are more similar to ourselves than people that are different. And so obviously we have kind of an in-group bias. So we usually tend to, you know, look out for people that are similar. So do you think AI could be any solution in recruiting people that are different to add more diversity in a group?
Would be for Laurence, I think.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. And this is actually something that the recruitment is already looking into, and how AI could play a role. The very first studies were worried that AI would reproduce stereotypes, because AI is not culture free, kind of. And right now, from what I could also see, is that it's quite the contrary. AI will provide tests that are more neutral and will maybe favor more diversity. However, we are not solving the problem. The sense AI will be maybe less biased in assessing the categorical merit. So, you know, the profile of the people and their strength. But once you come to the interview, AI will not be able to assess the fit. And as long as we consider we want fit with the people, then, you know, we're going to privilege certain groups and disqualify others. So could we be recruiting without considering fit at all? Some organizations do that, really, and they are not performing worse than others. So again, remember, the key is how you treat people. If you treat them with respect, if you consider that the other employees have something to bring, this is gonna work. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, due to the rising temperatures and the high risks, to the higher risks of extreme natural disasters caused by the climate crisis, do you think we'll see an increase in migration from warmer countries with poorer like infrastructure to combat the climate crisis, like e.g. sub-Saharan African nations, Asian nations, and of course Middle Eastern countries, to more temperate climates towards like Northern Europe? How would this affect policy making in Europe and other like European nation states?
Great question. Maybe Marta. Yeah.
That you can maybe,
Yeah.
because you're also involved in development studies, so it has to. So guys, it's not the question when it happens. I think that this is already the reality, because if we look at the scale, so we don't have at the European or at the international level one data set about forced migration flows. We have some estimates, and we have the online database publicly available about the internal displacement considered but mostly of internal nature. But if we look globally, for example, at the data by the International Organization for Migration, and what is published every 2 years now in the World Migration Reports, we can see the increase in general of the international migration flows, including those of forced nature. And obviously, very often we have this stereotype that only rich global north is the main destination for forced migrants. But for example, if we look at the statistics for intra-region migration only within Africa, we see that this is very high. So firstly, this forced migration flows happen there, mostly in Africa. So we see that, for example, from sub-Saharan countries, this goes to Maghreb. So still it's not, let's say, Europe and the EU. But then obviously the next stage, combined very often with now voluntary reasons like economic ones or family reunification, is about the EU. So what the EU can do and other countries. So I would say that the EU will fail with the Fortress Europe approach. And even if I think that the new pact on migration and asylum is not so bad, because still we need a kind of policy progress, we need new regulations, it is not the best possible solution for the current conditions. It's still very short-term or mid-term way of thinking, so up to 5 years. And what you say, this is about long-term thinking. So simply looking also from the historical perspective that migration flows happens across the globe between regions. So we need more global and meta way of thinking, not only like EU borders focused.
Mm-hmm. No, very good question. Just to differentiate, so far until now, we were talking about voluntary migration, and then this question fits into forced migration, right? ACNUR and the IOM, the UNHCR and the IOM, both UN agencies in terms that works with refugees and with internal displaced people, they confirmed that in 2022, the number of forced migration worldwide, it was 110 million. 1 year later, it was 120 million. That means that forced migration is increasing by around 10%. The forced migration, the different principle is that it fits under protection mechanism, right? International protection mechanism, while voluntary migration is completely different. It depends on the regulations that are between countries. What are the main causes of forced migration? First is conflict and violence. That's the main one. Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, there are big flows. The second is extreme weather risk, what you said. And the third one are political persecutions or harassments because of human rights violations, sexual orientation, etc. Right? The fourth one would be economic reason. It's true that out of these 120 million, around 60, 70 are internal displaced, so they move within the country, and then only 30 million are refugees, so are looking for asylum in another country. The main problem is, the main differentiation is that the conflict and the political persecution, they fit into the Convention of 1951, so they can ask, but those migrants, those forced migration that is due to climate, they are not fit into any convention, right? And that's an issue, right? And it's also very risky to include them in a convention because this is a situation that is going to be worsening, right? So here there is